Well, good morning, everyone. It's always a pleasure to be here on the Sunday morning. Let me start off with this. Who really knows, and who can swear, how creation came, when or where? Even God's came after creation's day. Who really knows, who can truly say? When and how did creation start? Did he do it, or did he not? Only he, up there, knows, maybe, or perhaps not even he. This is a verse from the ancient Hindu scriptures. And I resonated with this because I think it reflects, as I mentioned before, my past life. My first 60 years of life, I was agnostic. I had difficulty believing in a creator, but I couldn't disbelieve in it either. And I think there were three main reasons for this. One, when I look back and see religion, the formal religion, I see so much hypocrisy, so much violence, so much abuse of power. The second reason is I felt the way that the religions as I saw them presented the afterlife, heaven or hell, there's something in between, it just didn't make sense. And the third, I think, because I was educated as a scientist, have a very rational way of looking at things. So putting those three together, this gave me some ideas of what to come up with today. I should also add that I had the fortune to retire last year, and I find myself with a lot of time on my hands. And as I work on my other passion, which is my garden, communing with nature, with my plants and my fruits and my flowers, I got to studying a lot using my Bluetooth out in the garden, and I've gone really into depth on anthropology, on genetics, on the history of Homo sapiens. So again, putting all this together, I came up with today's topic, organic genesis and spiritual genesis. And the focus of the talk is basically from chapters 10 and 11 of the book of Genesis by Allan Kardec. And it's a book we don't normally talk about here on Sunday mornings. I warn you now that the talk is a little full of information, maybe heavy. Carl has got some more coffee out there if you feel getting a little bit sleepy and losing me. I'll try and go slow. But Susanna, when she asked me to do this talk a couple of months ago, it's a few days after I gave the last talk, she gave me the added carrot that I could choose my subject. Hence, I chose this one. Actually, when I saw her the next weekend, I said, what do you think of this topic? She said, well, I'm sure you'll try to make it interesting and you'll try and leave a very positive message for our Sunday audience to go home with. But I think you're crazy. And I hope she meant crazy in the sense I was being a little ambitious. Anyway, I hope I can prove her right on the first two and wrong on the last point. And I put a subtitle to this talk today, What Spiritism Can Contribute to the Evolutionism, Creationism Debate. And this will get clear as I get into the talk. So the way I've structured it is in actually 7 parts. I'm going to start off with Darwin. Darwin was probably one of the most influential humans in our history, along with Galileo and Copernicus and Newton and Einstein and all the rest of them. Made a really big impact on history. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we got to the theory of evolution. And then we're going to fast forward to today and see what scientific evidence there is today, 150, 60 years later, that supports evolution. And also going to look at the religious perspective. How is it received by the religious groups? And then we're going to get into Genesis, again, chapter 10, where Kardec talks about organic genesis. I want to bring in a brief history of planet Earth. And it's fascinating because this reflects a lot of the concepts I've talked about in these first 3 parts. Then we're going to go into the next chapter of Genesis, which is the spiritual Genesis. And this is the key to the lecture. This is the key. This was my aha moment when I was studying for this lecture. How much Kardec brings to this, our understanding of where we are today. Then we'll look at some of the evidence that I see as supporting that concept of spiritual genesis, and then some key learnings to take home. Okay? So I'm going to start off with Darwin. Quite an interesting character, very, very bright, obviously. He was very affluent. His father was a societal doctor. His mother was Sarah Wedgwood of the Wedgwood pottery. So between the two parents, there was a lot of wealth in the family. But he was very bright, had an interest in nature from a very early age. But before, I think he was about 19, his father sent him to Edinburgh to study medicine. He wasn't really interested in medicine. He was more interested in nature and didn't get along too well, so his father transferred him to Cambridge, where he studied theology, but also with a lot of natural history, and this is what really drove him. Then when he was just after he graduated with both a master's degree and a bachelor's and master's degree before he was 20, he got the opportunity to travel on HMS Beagle, and we'll go more into detail on that, and eventually 30 years later produced The Origin of Species. And 12 years after that, then The Descent of Man, which took that same concept but talking about the human race. What I also found interesting when I was looking at this is Kardec was a contemporary of Darwin. Kardec was born a little bit early and didn't live as long, but he too was born from a affluent family, French family. His father was a lawyer. He studied with Pestalozzi in Switzerland. Pestalozzi was a sort of revolutionary pedagogue. He introduced new methods of teachings that went from the sort of facts and fear way of teaching people to more of an involvement and discussion and debate. And he took that back to France and started his own school, continued his own education. He actually could speak, I think, 6 or 7 languages, which he used to actually support his work because he used to do translations. Also a medical doctor and scientist. And of course we know him as the codifier of Spiritism, and 50 years into his life he suddenly took a right-hand turn when he found this concept of Spiritism and dedicated the rest of his life to the subject. And he published this Spirits book in 1957. So it was 2 years, he published the first version of the Spirits book 2 years before Charles Darwin did The Origin of Species. And then the last book, Genesis, was again 2 years before The Descent of Man. So a lot of comparisons there. I got me thinking how much one influenced the other. All the work of Charles Darwin is available on a website, so you can actually search it digitally. And I went in there and looked for spiritualism, Spiritism, Kardec, and there's nothing that I can see that Darwin wrote about that. But I think Kardec, as we come to go through Genesis, was very obviously strongly influenced by Darwin. And just one final fact that, again, I found very interesting is that both of these books are still in print today. There's not many authors from 150 years ago that still there is a demand for their work, and they still continue to print books of the authors. So going on to Charles Darwin, his voyage on the HMS Beagle. It was actually planned for 2.5 years, took 5, and it was from the Majesty's government in England at the time of the colonialization of the world, and they wanted to get a better understanding of the South America. So the basic objective was to map the coast of South America. But this was actually the second trip of the Beagle. The first trip, unfortunately, the captain went crazy. He was so alone and so unfulfilled he committed suicide. The boat came back. So this second trip, they wanted to have someone who mainly company for the captain. Hence, Darwin was invited. Being invited, he was actually financed his own trip, or his parents, I should say, financed the trip. He had his board and keep on the boat, but when he spent most of his time on land, collecting samples, making notes, and that was all his responsibility. The voyage itself, as I say, went through around South America, and eventually stopped in Galapagos, and we'll see the importance of that in a minute. But eventually, after that, it circumnavigated the world and went back. Took 5 years. And he only spent 5 weeks on Galapagos Island, but this is what seeded the concept of evolution. So on the Galapagos Island, a little bit about them. There are a group of 12 islands. On the equator, they pertain to Ecuador, about 600 miles off the coast. And a group of 12 islands. We know now that the youngest of these islands, the volcanic islands, was created about 1 million years ago, and the oldest one was 3 million years old. So when he arrived there, he found this idyllic place and immediately was aware of all the different fauna that he'd never seen on the South American coast. Totally different. And then, of course, there's the famous giant tortoises. He noticed that each island had these special tortoises with different shapes of shells, different patterns, but all the same on that one island. He saw the iguanas, black iguanas that fed off seaweed underneath the water, eating for minutes and minutes at a time, completely different than the iguanas you've seen in South America. And then finally the finches, which I'm sure a lot of you will know, was really the driver to the conception of the thought of evolution. So he came back to England with a huge amount of data and continued to develop his evolutionary theory for the next 25 years. I think there was 2 reasons for this. One is that he was a perfectionist. He wanted to cross the I's and dot every T. But he also realized that what he was proposing was so revolutionary, not just to science, but to religion. And this is what sort of held him back. In fact, if it wasn't for another naturalist, a young naturalist, Alfred Wallace, 1858, he sent him a paper proposing basically the same thing, that the conclusion that Darwin was coming to. And he invited him together. They presented it to the Royal Society in England, and a year later he published his book on the origin of species. Like most scientific breakthroughs, the theory is very simple and yet elegant. Evolutionary theory is changing the heritable characteristics of biological populations over successive generations. And it's driven by four things. The first one is more offspring are produced than can possibly survive. Mother Nature is extremely cruel, produces a lot of offspring knowing that they will die. But that allows the traits that are good to carry on, to survive. Traits vary amongst the individuals. Different traits confer different rates of survival and reproduction, and they can be passed on from one generation to the next generation. So over time, new species are formed, and this is the whole basis of evolution. So let's go forward. And today, we have a huge amount of scientific evidence that just more reinforces this concept. I won't go through, I'll just pick out a few. One is comparative anatomy. Just for an example, this is the bone structures of various different animals, from the humans on the left to the whale in the middle. That I find most amazing. The whale has inside the flippers, the front flippers, a hand structure that's almost identical to the human hand. But again, it shows a common ancestry. We look at embryology. This is interesting too. This is a slide showing embryos in the very early stage of development through to the final finished product, if you like. So you see the fish on the left top corner and the mammal on the right are not too dissimilar, but the end up on the bottom corner is completely different. But again, indicating just a very visual representation of how we all came from the same source. Paleontology, at the time of Darwin, there were not that many fossils. Today we have literally millions of fossils. They're all been classified and documented. And one of the arguments against Darwin at the time was, oh, there's a missing link. How do we go from dinosaurs to birds, or birds to so on and so forth? Another example on that missing link was the whale. The whale is anomalous because it's a mammal, but it lives in the sea and comes up to breathe. But again, we found all the fossils that show its evolution over time. And finally, the most convincing argument, which has only really come to light over the last 30 years, is genetics. And we know today we all share 96% of our genes with that of a chimpanzee, and 36% of the genes are that of a banana. So again, it just really is the nail in the coffin. It really shows that the theory of evolution is more a fact. So we'll talk about religion now, and this is quite surprising. I'm going to start off with this question that was used in a Pew survey in 2007 in the US, asking people, do you believe the evolution is the best explanation for the origins on Earth? And so very surprisingly, is that less than half the people in the US do not believe, they do not accept evolution. And if you look at the bottom right, this is by different religious groups, but you can see that the Protestants and evangelicals are very resistant to accept evolutionary theory. And just a little bit on this. This neo-creationism is basically the view that the Bible is everything. The Bible explains everything. The earth was created. There was nothing before 6,000 plus years ago. Everything was created then by God and Adam and Eve, and et cetera, et cetera. And they really believe this to the extent that it's very concerning as a scientist. An example of this is this Answers in Genesis Museum in Kentucky. Built $27 million, gets 1 million visitors a year. And in that museum, they demonstrate that the Bible is right and science is wrong. And this museum has busloads of children arriving every day, and they're trying to teach them that evolution is wrong. The Bible is right. He's now created, it's almost like a theme park. This is a Noah's Ark, $100 million, bought about 2 years ago. And it reconstructs what they believe is Noah's Ark, and how he managed to get all these animals in there and keep them alive, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, something very recently, the last couple of weeks, there's been a museum opened in Washington, downtown Washington, D.C., called the Museum of the Bible. $500 million. And this is being, again, financed by individuals who've got very neo-creationist views. Okay, so let's move on to Genesis. Second part of the talk. There's a little bit of reading here, so bear with me. And I just tried to capture some of the main points that Cadet brings out. So the first section, he talks about the formation of living beings. Time when animals didn't exist, hence had a beginning. So there's a concurrence that there was a simultaneous and multiple creation of both plant and animal species. So we go back in time. He's saying in Genesis that yes, all over the planet as it was then, there was spontaneous, somehow life started. The formation of the first living beings may be deduced from analogy of the same laws which, I can't read this very well, sorry about that, inorganic bodies are formed, and it's chemistry, because when we get down to it, the basic starting point is chemistry, the attraction between elements. When combined, elements lose their properties and different characteristics. So when oxygen and hydrogen come together, which are both gases, they form water. And again, it depends on this affinity. And they come together in fixed proportions. So again, water, it's 2 atoms of hydrogen to 1 of water. And this law presides over all substances. It shows that the importance of chemistry on inorganic and organic inorganic chemistry. Inorganic chemistry is basically just the basic elements without the exception of carbon. Carbon is organic chemistry, all about how carbon combines. And carbon is very unique in that it has this fantastic affinity to combine with hydrogen and others. And this is what is the basis of life. So the conclusion is, because constituents of organic and inorganic beings are the same, we conclude that, like the first rocks, bodies of the first living beings are formed by the aggregation of elementary molecules by virtue of the law of affinity, to the degree of the conditions were favourable. And this is the first kingdom, the mineral kingdom. It's affinity, it's his greatest attribute. He then introduced the concept of the vital principle. The fact that minerals, plants and animals formed by the same constituents, we must understand this applies only in the material sense. Organic matter contains a special elusive principle, the vital principle, active in living, extinct in dead. The vital principle comes from the universal cosmic fluid. I'm not going to go into that today, there's not time. But if you want to read Genesis. It exists because we see its effects. If base elements combine without the vital principle, then only form minerals and inorganic bodies. Activity of the vital principle is maintained during life by the activity of the organs. Death arises when the vital principle is extinguished. Sorry, let me go back there. Skip one. In the combination of elements to form organic bodies, electricity is produced. This is written 160 years ago. A particular kind of electricity called animal electricity, released by the activity of the organs and whose production ceases upon death. And we've all got examples of this. We've all had electrocardiogram or electrocephalograph. We have electricity in our bodies. But yet, before these techniques were evolved, the spirits were telling Kardec that fact. He talks about spontaneous generation. We haven't time to go into that. But also the scale of organic beings. There's no clear marked delineation between plant and animal kingdom. And he gives the example of zoophytes, which are corals and sea sponges. Simplest forms are fixed to the ocean floor or the soil. A higher step is the animal, is free and goes in search of nourishment. Next in the order of development are the organs, the vital activity and instinct. And he gives some examples of worms, mollusks, octopi, until we get to mammals, the most complete. If we consider the two ends of the chain, there's no apparent analogy. So again, if we compare us with a bacteria, there's no difference, yet there's a continuum all the way through. Thus, understand that there is only spontaneous generation for the most elementary organic beings. More complex species will be the product of successive transformations as conditions became suitable, the environment, the heat, whatever. This theory, though not accepted as definitive, is the one that prevails in science today, written in 1868, as it regards by serious observers of the most rational. And here I'm sure that Kardec was making reference to Darwin. And finally, he goes on to human beings. From the corporeal and purely anatomical point of view, humans belong to the class of mammals, differing only from them for their outward appearance. Humans belong to biped order, above that of the quadrupeds, the ape family. There is an unbroken, gradual chain in which all the links are connected, lichen to tree, zoophyte to human being. Each step is an improvement, a transformation of the one immediately below it. Human beings must resign themselves, pride aside, I like that, to seeing their physical body as the last link to animality on earth. However, the more the body decreases in importance in human psyche, the more the spiritual principle increases in importance. And this last sentence, I think, is so powerful and insightful. Spiritism walks hand in hand with materialism on the terrain of matter. It accepts everything that materialism accepts. But at the point where materialism stops, Spiritism goes further. Spiritism and materialism are like two travelers who journey together from the same starting point, continue on the way, and discover a whole new world. Having gone a certain distance, one says, "I cannot go any farther," while the other continues on his way and discovers a whole new world. Having come to this point with Genesis, materialism stops, where Spiritism carries on with its research in the realm of spiritual Genesis. So this is the end of the chapter on Genesis from Kardec. You can see the way that the scientific and the evolutionary theory do match what Kardec's thinking is. Decided to do a little very brief study of the planet Earth, starting off from 4.6 billion years ago. And when you start talking billions of years, it becomes very difficult to visualize and conceive all these different time frames. So I put the history of this 4.6 billion years, and I'm using a piano keyboard to illustrate this. So we go from on the left-hand side, the formation of Earth, and on the right-hand side where we are today. So there's 52 keys on the keyboard, white keys. So each one of these keys represents about 90 million years. Okay, you with me so far? Everyone want some coffee or okay? Okay, so we start off, when the Earth was formed, it was extremely hot, this cauldron of material, molten, of lava, but it started to cool. It took 500 million years to cool down, but it got to the point where liquid was formed. The water started to condense out of the atmosphere, and we got liquid water. And that gave way to the oldest rocks. That's how we know. There's a lot of science behind this that gives us all this credibility. And then, 3.5 billion years ago, we got the origin of life. The prokaryotic cells, bacteria, which are basically we have in our gut today, same, they're cousins. This is where life started. Now, there's a lot of speculation of how life has started. And a lot of scientists are working on ways that they can actually recreate life. Certain groups have actually produced amino acids, which are the basis of DNA. And maybe within my lifetime, there'll be some group will come up with some definitive experiment that proves they can actually start life. But I just heard about recently a group of scientists in Manchester in England who got some together the basic chemicals that we know were present at the time of the 3.5 billion years ago when life started. They managed to dissolve it in water, applying heat and some external force, and actually created the most beautiful game. Sorry, I'm just playing with you here, but that's why Manchester City and Manchester United are on the top of the English Premier League, by the way. Okay, let's have a drink here. So, next. Now, evolutionary path. About 1 billion years later, we get photosynthesis. By this time, the atmosphere of the Earth had cleared, and the sun was going to come through, hit the surface of the oceans, and the cells on the surface found they could find a way of absorbing that energy from the sun, combining with the carbon dioxide in the water to produce energy to grow and multiply and give off oxygen in the process. And in giving off oxygen, the oxygen levels in the atmosphere started to build up. They were zero at the time, but after a while, they got to the point where other cells found they could actually extract that oxygen directly from the atmosphere or from the dissolved in the ocean, and we get respiration. So that gave rise to the next class of cells, which are the eukaryotic cells. And these are more complex organisms with nuclei now. And that led to the next very important stage, which is the origin of sexual reproduction. It took a billion years for this process to be refined. So next time you think about sex, remember there's 1 billion years in its making. And then we get what was called the Cambrian explosion. There was a huge explosion of all different life forms. First animal, first plants, amphibians. And then what happened was, at that time, there was just one continent, Pangaea. This is about 250, 300 million years ago. And it started to break up. It was one continent, one ocean. And then it broke up into the various continents we see today. So I want to move on. So here's our 4.6 million years. And I'm going to take just that last 2.5 keys on the keyboard, divide that into 50. So now we're talking about, on the left-hand side of this second scale, 250 million years, and the right-hand one today. So let's continue with our journey. Around 250 million years ago came the Permian extinction. This was we don't know the cause of it, probably volcanic action from these continents splitting apart, but it destroyed 96% of all the species. So all that good work that had gone on before, 96%, not just living things, 96% of the species were destroyed. But soon after that, the mammals came through, 30 million years later. And then there was this is actually the fourth extinction. There was two previous extinctions before the Permian. The Triassic extinction eliminated a certain group of animals, and it gave rise to the growth of the dinosaurs. And that, from the next, I can't remember how many years now, but a lot of years, the dinosaurs migrated into birds, evolved into birds. And we got the first flowers. There was no flowers before that time. There was vegetation, but no flowers. And then we came along with the fifth extinction, 65 million years ago, and this is when we know pretty much certain there's a meteorite hit the Yucatan Peninsula and destroyed all the dinosaurs. And then we get the primates, apes, and eventually to the hominids, and the hominids are our ancestors. And we'll come back to those in a minute. So I want to go back now to spiritual genesis. And just as the tie-in from organic genesis, he ends by saying, having come to this point with organic genesis, materialism stops, whereas spiritism carries on with its research in the realm of spiritual genesis. So then, in the first part of spiritual genesis, he introduces the concept of the spiritual principle. The existence of the spiritual principle is a fact which, so to speak, has no more need of demonstration than that of the material principle. It is affirmed by its own effects. Remember, Kardec used to love to say, every cause has an effect, and every intelligent cause has an intelligent effect. The idea of the perpetuity of the spiritual being is innate in human beings. Throughout civilization, all the past civilization have this drive that there is life after death. And all the customs and everything, their whole life was aimed towards maximizing that life after death. So together with reasoning, we've got there's an indication we have immortality. Are the spiritual principle and the vital principle the same? No. Plants live, but they don't think. Since matter has a virtuality independent of the spirit, and spirit has a virtuality independent of the matter, hence the two are different principles. Spiritual principle has its own independent existence. What is the origin of the spiritual principle, Kardec asks? And really the means of investigation are lacking. Humans can only verify what exists. Everything else we can only hypothesize. Whether knowledge is beyond current intelligence, it is useless to currently possess it. This is the words of Kardec. But he goes further. God has not even given it to us, even through revelation. What is known is supreme justice, an attribute of divinity. All human spirits are created equal and ignorant, with an aptitude to progress, reaching perfection through their own personal efforts. Just as God has produced material worlds throughout all eternity, God has also created spirits throughout all eternity. Otherwise, material worlds would have no objective. Material worlds are there for us because that's what we use as spirits. And the other thing is God has also created spirits throughout all eternity. It's a continuous process. If you go back to that keyboard, that started 4.6 billion years ago. But the Earth, the Big Bang, was almost 14 billion years ago. So there was two more keyboards to the left, right? So there was other planets, other planets like us where life evolved and spirits evolved. So when the Earth started, there was spirits at the highest level, the pure spirits. So progress is the normal condition of spirit beings. Hence it follows that throughout all eternity, there have also been beings who have reached that culminating point. Again, I'm saying pure spirits. Even before the Earth came into being, worlds have succeeded worlds. And when the Earth emerged from the chaos of the elements, space was already populated with spirit beings at every level of advancement. So at the start of the Earth, there was tons of spirits out there, just waiting for us to be ready. He talks about the union of the spiritual principle matter. I'm not going to go into that. But just another point, a hypothesis concerning the origin of human bodies. The bodies of apes could well have served as garments for the first human spirits. Whoops, let me go back there, sorry. In accepting this hypothesis, the intellectual activity of its new inhabitant, with the intellectual activity of its new inhabitant, the envelope comes modified and give origin to a new species that gradually pulled away from the primitive type as the spirit progressed. We tend to think that material science and if you look at the evolution of the human being, it's all material. But there was a huge impact from the spirit that came in. The spirit helped to sculpture the material body. So there is a dichotomy, there is a symbiosis of the two. He goes on to talk about incarnation of spirits and the perispirit, the semi-material envelope, which is linked to matter by its origin and to spirituality by its ethereal nature. And with that fluidic tie starts at the conception, when the vital principle of the fetus is connected molecule by molecule to the spirit by means of the perispirit. As the tie strengthens, the spirit becomes confused and finally loses all awareness and only recovers after birth. The spirit then recovers its faculties without memories of the past while retaining qualities and aptitudes. And this is key. This is the key to the whole process of evolution, of reincarnation. So he talks about reincarnation and emigration and immigration of spirits. And he says that reincarnation is a necessary consequence of the law of progress. Without reincarnation, how can one explain the differences between the present social state of that of times of barbarianism? If souls are created all at the same time as the body, those being born today are as new and primitive as those who lived 1,000 years ago. And we see evidence today of so many young children that at the age of 5 are playing the piano. I mean, where does that come from? It comes from the spiritual element. During the interval between corporeal existence, spirits in the errant state are in the errant state, and the two populations incessantly circulate from one to the other. At various times, determined by divine intervention, we have mass emigrations and immigrations as a result of the calamities and cataclysms reinvigorating and transforming the globe. And what we hear today, we're in an era of transformation. And then he goes to talk about the Adamic race. According to the teaching of Spiritism, is one of these mass immigrations, or rather spirit colonies from another globe, that gave us rise to the race symbolizing Adam, and for that reason we call it the Adamic race. The Adamic race was more advanced and intelligent and drove all the others to progress. And this is where spiritual genesis ends in Kardec's book. But I think it's important, this is a bit of a cliffhanger, so I'm going to go forward and I'm going to bring in Emmanuel. And in his book, On the Way to Light, which is 70 years after Genesis, he starts off by talking a little bit about planetary genesis and the community of pure spirits. And it's just as a lead into this part of the talk. From what we've been told, the community of pure spirits, made up of perfected angelic beings, of which Jesus is one of the divine members, has met only twice in the course of the millennia to decide urgent matters pertaining to the organization of our planet. The first meeting took place when the terrestrial globe detached from the solar nebula, 4.6 billion years ago. The second, when the Lord's coming to earth was determined in order to teach the immortal lesson of the gospel of love and redemption to the human family. This book is an amazing book. I read it twice. The second time, I actually went back. He more chronicles the evolution of mankind, but he goes back through all these different personas throughout history who had an impact, and a lot of them I never heard of. And I look in Google, sure enough, it's bang on. This was written, before the time of, this was written by Ashiko. So if you want any proof that reincarnation and spirit communication exists, this book is probably the most amazing example. But he goes on to talk about the planetary genesis. He talks about the ancestors of human beings. Under the guise of the spiritual realm, there are a few races of anthropoids in the lower Pliocene era, which is about 5 to 2 million years ago. These anthropoids were the ancestors of both human beings and the modern-day apes. And he shows out, where did these come from? Okay, well, they came from Capella. This is what they tell us. Many thousands of years ago, the Capella system, which is in the constellation Auriga, it's about 42 light years away, reached the end of its revolutionary cycle. Several million rebellious spirits were living there, making it difficult to consolidate the hard-earned gains of those people full of compassion and virtue. Remember, they were considered rebellious, but they were much more advanced than certainly the bodies that they reincarnated in at the time, and certainly more advanced than we are today. But they were considered rebellious because that planet in Capella was on its final cusp of the next phase of evolution. So they came to Earth. Jesus received that horde of suffering and unhappy spirits into the light of his kingdom of love and justice. And they tell us a bit more about the four great peoples. Over time, these exiled beings came together in 4 large groups, just as they had during their lives on Capella. They became part of the most ancient peoples, in keeping together with their sentiment and liquids and affinities that connected them. United once again, they formed these 4 main groups: the Aryans, which were descended into the white people of India and Europe, the civilization of Egypt, the people of Israel, and the caste of India. There's a lot of information. There's a lot of characteristics about these groups and how they're influenced, the development. Read on the way to the light. There's a lot of stuff. Maybe that's a topic for another talk. So just going back to the last history I showed you was this, we're ending in the hominids. So I want to just go one step further here. Actually 2. Let's take that last square, and now we're going to look at the world in the last 5 million years now. So this 5 million years is just about the edge of that last key on that total scale of 4.6. So you can see how much is happening in these last few centuries. Okay, so what happened in this time? Well, we had the first fossils of this gentleman here, not very pretty, but in Kenya about 4 million years ago. Homo habilis. Habilis was called so because he was really clever with his hand. He had tools. He was found in Tanzania. These are just some of the many, many different, now extinct family members from our family tree. Then there was Homo erectus. He traveled out of Africa to Europe and Asia. This is talking how he lived for about almost 2 million years. A little bit prettier now. And then finally we get to the Neanderthals, 230 million years to 30,000 years ago. And this is interesting. Again, he's still not pretty, but you can see how the physiology of the races are changing from as the forehead is back, forehead comes forward with the increased brain size, the chin and the jaw reduces in size because they were learning to cook and condense all the protein so that it allows more time, didn't need to have much chewing power, and also had more time to do other things because the brain was growing. Our brain uses 25% of all the energy we consume. So, and then the last around 5 to 13 million million years ago, we get Homo sapiens. Sorry, I said that wrong, didn't I? 65,000 years ago was the start of the Homo sapiens. That's what all the science indicates. And last, just one last time scale for you here. I'm going to take just the last 50,000 years to today. So again, this time spell of 50,000 years is probably not even the line on the right-hand side of the top keyboard. So each one represents about 1,000 years. So we have our first ancestors of Homo sapien. About 33,000 years ago, we developed art. Then 12,000 years ago or so, we got the agricultural society. And then everything explodes. We have the pyramids 6,000 years ago. We have Easter Island with these amazing characters. We have Stonehenge. We have the Pantheus. We have Colosseum. This all happened in a period of time that was just as an explosion of the last few thousand years. How could that happen? How could that happen? Well, it happened with the immigration of all the spirits. When we go back to 50,000 years ago, there was probably only about 10,000 Homo sapiens on our planet Earth. And today we have 7.5 billion, right? So in that explosion, in that increase of all these Homo sapiens, you have to have spirits. And where do the spirits come from? All those spirits that have had past lives in other planets, other planetary systems. And that really, I think this is proof to me, I don't know how convincing you, but this is proof of the spiritual principle. So, just to finish off, the key learnings. Theory of evolution is now a proven fact based on current evidence from a multitude of scientific disciplines. Again, proven fact. In science, you've got to be very careful about proven fact. Science is never absolute. It's always relative to the information at the time. But certainly, based on the information we have today, we're just getting more and more convinced that evolution theory does work. Many religions, therefore, still negate Darwinian evolution and believe in the neo-evolution based on a strict interpretation of the Bible. They even use that to try and scientifically explain some of the steps that maybe it's a little bit, when, for instance, the development of the eye. How could the eye develop from what? It either works totally or it doesn't. And they tend to try to use science to explain that, but it's not science, it's a theory. Belief in Darwinian evolution does not negate the belief in the Creator. That's where I am today. And many distinguished scientists, and less distinguished scientists like myself, are now believe in God. I call God the grand organizing designer. Science and religion are not contradictory, but complementary. They were in the past, but now there's a conversion of science and religion. Spiritism expands the understanding of the organic genesis and evolution by introducing the additional component of the evolution of the spirit. Evidence of reincarnation is extensive, we all know that. The key spiritual principle is that the soul is immortal, and at each successive reincarnation provides an opportunity to learn from past choices, to evolve both intellectually and morally, eventually reaching a pure spiritual state. Spiritual genesis provides supporting evidence for the explosion of the intellect and morality of Homo sapiens over the last 12,000 years. And finally, Homo sapiens have continued to evolve both intellectually and spiritually, in parallel and complementary paths, since our species embarked on the reincarnation process. There is little doubt as to the intellectual evolvement of Homo sapiens, evidenced by the technological advancements of today. You show an iPhone 10 to somebody from 30 years ago, and they say, "What's this?" You know, it's incredible, and it's frightening too. Where we'll be in another 10 years. But contrary to general opinion, Homo sapiens are living in the most peaceful period in our history. This is very difficult to comprehend. But it's proven, and there's a lot of good work where people have looked at rates of homicides over centuries, over millennia. And now we have, the reason it's very difficult, I think there's two factors. One is we're 7.5 billion people, so there's going to be some that are misfits out there. And unfortunately, because of the communication we have today, we hear them before the good people, you know. So those are two factors, but believe me, and if you want to challenge it, I'll show you evidence that we are living in the most people's time in history. I have a little 2 minutes here for Londonese. I think I'll leave it at that.